Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, we talk a lot about the core content areas, and we spend a lot of time talking about literacy. We are all literacy teachers. There's even literacy in math, because if students don't understand the words, how are they going to understand what it is exactly they're meant to solve, particularly if it's a word problem? Clearly, literacy, and in particular, the reading of nonfiction or informational text, is the responsibility of every teacher, not just the ELA teacher. And so this is why I'm really excited to be talking to Gwen Pauloski. She is a literacy specialist, and we're going to be talking about her new book, which is called Making Deep Sense of Informational Text, a Framework for Strengthening Comprehension in Grades 6 through 12. Gwen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Gwen, how did literacy development, and in particular, helping educators to understand their role in teaching informational text, how did that become an area of interest for you?
I was a social studies teacher for 9 years. I had maybe one content area reading course in my teaching preparation. So when I stumbled upon the problem that teachers in every discipline have, who are secondary teachers, that my students were not successful in reading the text that I needed them to read in order to learn the material for my class, I was really perplexed. I didn't know what to do. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that they're just not trying, that they're, quote, lazy, that they don't care. And I hear that too much when we're talking about middle and high school kids. So I started trying to learn what to do. And it really was a personal crusade. I had kids, they weren't able to master my content because they could not make sense of the text that we were reading. And so the first thing I did, this was mid to late 90s. So we were starting to get the technology to be able to do we had web-based, we could do web pages and we could do slides, simplify the written content so much. We would read together. I would put illustrations. I would do all of these scaffolds for my 8th graders. But at some point I realized I'm digesting the text for the kids, like a mama bird, if you will. My students still weren't able on their own to make sense of a grade level text in history. And so that's where it all started. I started getting training. I started finding trainings on the subject of content area strategies, which is what they were calling them back then, content area reading. And it's been a lifelong obsession since then because it's hard. And I think that we keep going in a wrong direction. We can do much better than what we're currently doing.
Gwen, I'm glad that you mentioned your example of being like the mama bird and digesting the information before you spit it back out to the babies. Because while in some senses that's okay if you're a social studies teacher or a science teacher, and the goal is to teach the content standards. But to your point, if we do want to help our students to become lifelong readers and independent readers, at some point, whether we're the social studies teacher, the science teacher, or even perhaps the math teacher, the art teacher even, it's important that they do read text on grade level. We shouldn't always have to scaffold the reading because, like you said, Gwen, we're doing our students a disservice if we're doing that. So this leads me right to my next question. In terms of helping students read the grade level text, you were mentioning some strategies to do that. What are those strategies?
It's funny because we're in a moment right now in the last few years where strategies have suddenly become bad news, and in some quarters they don't work. Teaching strategies doesn't work. That is absolutely, there's no research basis for that claim. But what is true is that the way a lot of schools are dealing with strategy instruction at the secondary level, it's not working well. So you think about a third grade class, and they're learning how to, quote, find the main idea for the first time. That's the first time they're getting instruction in a classroom. You will probably have some short, considerate texts that are structured well, that have text features that are very clear, and it's written for the kids to be able to understand. Then a lot of times kids are taught things like look at the first sentence or look at the first paragraph and find a sentence that seems to be the main idea. And so kids are learning then at that age, maybe they're learning how to really read and make sense of the text, but it's a short, simple text. Unfortunately, what I found in my middle school kids, the message that they took was look, not read. So when I have taught college students, when I've taught graduate students, I find this hunting behavior, skimming, scanning, sampling, right? Pulling out the answer to whatever question. It is a good strategy when all you have to do is find an answer. We do it when we're looking on the web and we're trying to find some information. We scan and skim and we sample. Unfortunately, what I found with my 7th graders, with my 9th graders, and my college students is that they're doing that when they need to be making
Sense of the entire text. But
Yeah.
we do have to get into the weeds and actually read what it is we're supposed to read. So,
Yeah.
what are some ways that
Sure.
you would recommend secondary students read and understand informational text?
I had been teaching comprehension strategies as an English teacher for a while for literary texts. I knew how to do that. But what I learned from reading research is that there are strategies that really only apply to informational text, and there are a lot of strategies that have to work differently with informational text. Strong comprehenders do it naturally. They preview the text, they look at the text features, they read the first paragraph, right? And so we have to teach that to at least half of our middle and high school students who do not yet have that skill to make sense of the longer text that we're giving them, the more complex text. Sometimes I don't think we realize when we ask kids to read a website, right, for a social studies course, a science course, or a science article, a lot of times we don't realize just how much complexity is built into texts that are not written for children. And so teaching them how to preview that kind of text is not the same as when they learned how to do it in 3rd grade. We have to keep building that. So some of the strategies that I take people through in the book, and for each of the strategies, there is a learning guide, front and back. And so the strategies are things like checking for understanding. How do you check for understanding when it is a longer science article? What about when they're alone? We assume that if we ask a bunch of comprehension questions and children answer them in our classrooms, that somehow they're internalizing that skill, and that when they're reading alone, that they'll be monitoring their own comprehension. They don't. a minority, smaller than half, right? Kids are not independently doing those things that we just assume they learned in elementary. There are some other strategies that are more complex, like considering perspectives when you're reading an argumentative text. The strategies that I built really work to make this relevant for teens today help them to slow down and understand the author's argument, consider the author's perspective, other people's perspectives, and their own perspectives so that they can see, I might have a bias here. I might have an opinion. I need to look at other people's point of view. So it goes from the simple stuff, previewing a text before you read it, and it takes students all the way through summarizing and presenting their reading, like when they've read several texts, then they're trying to synthesize information for a presentation. Really runs the gamut.
When you're talking about helping students to be independent thinkers when they're reading, one way that I work, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this with educators, is having students do something like Cornell Notes, where they could either be putting the questions that they have from a text in the Cornell Notes, or if what they are reading is consumable, if they're annotating the text, they could put their questions in the corner. And I suggest to teachers that they give students the depth of knowledge question stems so that the students could figure out lower and higher level questioning. So that's a strategy that I use with folks when they're reading informational text with students.
Absolutely. And built into, so for each of the 14 strategies in the book, I help teachers figure out how to explicitly teach the strategy. Like I make very specific suggestions to walk through that first teach, and then how to support kids in doing that gradual release. They're essential scaffolds because we're teaching kids what questions to ask themselves. In the summarization strategy, summarizing frame a scaffold, right? It is a temporary support on the way to being able to summarize without that structure. Before I planned my dissertation research, I was monitoring our state test, reading test, with a group of sixth graders. And I'm a passionate annotation proponent. I teach my students how to annotate. I expect them to annotate. We practice all the jazz. I teach it explicitly, right? Because if I just tell them to annotate, they will do it mindlessly. So I'm watching the kids with this reading test. It's a paper test, unfortunately. I watched two kids they had gotten highlighters and they had passed out highlighters. So two kids were using them in a way that made sense. They were reading, they had the highlighter, they were marking words and phrases that were relevant. I watched other kids just coloring, right? And I watched the vast majority of kids when their teacher was not in the room and nobody was making them. They weren't doing anything. They were sitting back in their chairs and they were staring at the paper and reading. You and I both know if you read an article on a topic that is not familiar to you, and it is a complex text for you as a strong reader, you might zone out, right? You might start thinking about what you need to pick up at the grocery store. You, as a strong reader, bring your attention back again and again. You refocus yourself. So the very first strategy that Deep Sense tackles is focusing the mind. So the strategies that you're talking about, the scaffolds like summarization frames, question stems, Cornell Notes plus monitoring your own understanding, brilliant.
You were talking about that being one of the four pillars, engaging in a scholarly way with text, students
Yeah.
engaging with text in a scholarly way.
That's right.
So, with that said, Gwen, what are the other three pillars when it comes
Sure.
to reading informational text?
So the first thing that I have found The kids who struggle the most with comprehension when they're coming into sixth grade, ninth grade, 12th grade, usually their self-esteem, their reading esteem, if you will, has taken quite a hit. They tend to believe what I'm afraid a lot of adults believe too, including some of our students' parents, that you are either a good reader or a bad reader. You'll hear it in educator talk. Oh, he's just a bad reader. What does that even mean? So, what I push as the first place that we have to work is kids' psychology, if you will. It is rebuilding their belief in themselves as competent, agentive readers. That even if I've worked with kids who made huge progress in comprehension, even though maybe they were still developing their English language vocabulary, for instance. They've been here for 6 years, but they still have a relatively small English vocabulary. Maybe they don't read a lot outside of school. It doesn't keep them from being able to really increase their comprehension. Those kids, in a lot of situations where their test scores aren't good, they're getting a lot of feedback that they're just not that good at reading, they think it's too late. And I think that some teachers in secondary think they either needed to have already gotten it or not. It's just not the way comprehension works. So comprehension, unlike phonics, is an unbounded skill set. If you think about it, you are a much stronger reader now than you were even as a 10th grader because of your experience, because of the breadth of things you've read. You're reading a book, a novel, and you talk to a friend about it. We keep developing and deepening our comprehension skills.
So then, not only increasing our comprehension skills as students, but gaining the confidence that we can do it. You mentioned
Yeah.
this as being the first pillar.
Yeah.
What are some of the strategies you would recommend to teachers when working with students who have been beaten down? How do we get them to think more positively about their reading experience?
I tell people, even though I've done a whole bunch of work on the explicit teaching of strategies, I swear my coaching with kids on this is the thing that I believe makes the biggest difference. So the first thing is when a kid comes into my classroom and I see that they have had a negative experience with test scores, for instance, I see their history, or I give them a little assessment early on in the year. I see that their annotations are absolutely surface. They are showing no depth of comprehension. The first thing I do is do not assume anything about why that is, right? Instead of assuming, oh, this kid didn't try or he can't, I try to understand. So I may quietly have a conversation with that student and say, hey, tell me about what you were thinking about when you were working on this text. Tell me more about that. And kids will tell you. They may feel shame about their reading. They may have convinced themselves that they hate to read. They may be so distracted, either because they just don't have a habit of focusing their minds or because they're thinking about something that's really bothering them. I had a student who, this was after that dissertation research, and so he had really worked hard and made a lot of improvement on our in-class assessments that I was doing along the way. His annotations were getting deeper. His summaries were getting longer and more complex. And then he comes to this mock state test that we used as one of my post measures for the dissertation. He bombed it. I'm sitting there looking at this data, and of course, my first thought is, oh man, that just pulled down my mean. But it was an outlier. And so I asked him, hey, what happened? And he told me, I had the flu, miss. I got so sick. I had a fever, and my mom wouldn't let me stay home from school because that mom wanted. And so that was the answer. If you watch students when you ask them to read something early in the year, ask them to read an article and watch them. Watch the ones who sit back and stare. They're not engaging actively in the text. I'll watch other kids who are laboring. They learn to annotate and they're rewriting every line in the side. They're trying to please me. I watch them because each of those kids might need a little something different from me. But what I can always do when a kid says, "Oh, I just hate this. I just hate reading. It's so boring." I'll say something like, "Sweetie, what I have found is that when things are hard for me, I don't like them." I made a bet with a student, a sixth grader who had never been diagnosed with dyslexia. He had never passed the state test. And he told me, "I hate reading, period, end of sentence," right? And I said, "I hate running because I'm not good at it. And I'm not good at it because I don't do it because it's hard." I made him a bet. I said, "If you will work for me and you will read with all of your heart and you will try again." This was a sixth grader. He was already done. "If you will put your whole self into this and trust me that I can coach you up to where you're going to get stronger, I will sign up for a 5K and I will run around the same time as the state test." And we both kept our commitment. If you see pictures from that 5K, you will see me running extremely slowly. I look like I'm walking, but I never walked. I ran the whole time.
It's funny you're saying all of this because as you're talking, Gwen, I'm also seeing the connection between social emotional learning, right? Where if we really want to change mindsets of students who feel stuck, feel that they're not quote unquote good readers, one strategy I recommend, and I think you could do this in elementary through high school. One strategy is, hey, everyone, you each have a post-it note. Write down something you saw somebody else do
Hmm.
that you honor. And somebody could write, I really liked how John asked that question about blah, blah, blah in the
Yeah.
text. Because
Yeah.
I know if somebody saw me doing that and positively commented on that,
Yeah.
that would get me thinking maybe I'm not as bad at reading as I
Yeah.
think.
Absolutely.
So I think that and I've done one or two episodes on SEL. We could definitely do more on the podcast. Whereas,
Yeah.
how do you bring in growth discussion in your academic classes? And
Yeah.
I see a direct tie-in between growth in reading informational texts, or really, frankly, reading in general. So I definitely see the importance of that pillar. We talked about the pillar where we're engaging with text in a scholarly way. We're talking about our thinking. We're thinking about our thinking, in other
Yeah. Metacognition.
right? So what are the other two pillars that you talk
So, and they're not sequential. This is very flexible. In the book, I suggest if you're working in a healthy grade level team, the English teacher might do the initial teach of a few strategies. The team might decide, you know what, we're not even going to bother with the more advanced ones. Let's just focus on these 5 for the year. Not very growth mindset. That explicit teaching of the strategies is the second prong, right? After building the kids' confidence. In other words, you don't wait until their confidence
Correct.
built,
Right.
because when they start learning the strategies, the first 2-pager that the kids get in the book is giving them the skinny about informational text and how we make sense of it. Because when they start to understand, hey, guess what? The reading did get harder in middle school and it got harder again in high school. There's a reason that it's harder, because the texts are harder than you had in elementary. So no shame in the game, right? They need to hear that. It's going to take more effort, and we're all going to hold hands and make sense of this text together. We're going to work on it for a few days. I know that teachers think, I don't have time to focus on one text for 4 days. Pick an interesting topic in your course that kids, and find an article that is going to pique their interest. It's about something that they can wrestle with, they can talk about, they can make sense of, and then teach them that one strategy. We're going to focus on determining the text structure today. You talked about problem solution description. Maybe the text is a problem solution text, and you've noticed that kids are struggling with that kind of text, or they don't really know how to identify. So you're going to stop Maybe you do it before you start reading the text. Maybe you do it in the middle. And you're going to do a first teach lesson on a strategy. You're going to do a quick model. You're going to tell them why it's important. You can work with that article that you're going to read. Let's practice. So you're going to do that teacher modeling. You're going to do that guided practice, and then a little bit of independent practice. Then we're going to immediately apply it as we study this text together. I'm going to spot you. We're spotting kids all the time. We're making sure that they don't drop the barbell on their feet, right? We watch and we wait. And if we hear, let's say that I've asked teams, I usually have teams of 4 if I can, but teams of 3 will do. I asked them to discuss a question about the text that we just read through once. And I realized this group has it. They're on task. They're focusing on what I wanted them to do. But this team over here, they're arguing with each other and starting to or they're all just sitting there waiting for the last student to shut up so that they can say their part, and they're not really listening. I will sit down with them and coach them on that thing. That's the second strategy, is how to talk about text. We actually have to teach kids how to do that. They'll argue or they'll do what I call turn taking. Tune everybody out, wait for your turn, say your piece, go back into your happy place.
It's funny, Gwen, as you're talking about those discussion strategies, it's one reason why I love Save the Last Word for Me, which is everyone goes in turn, but they have to comment on what the other person said. You have to listen to what that other person said, because it's not what you think or what resonated with you. It's your thoughts on what resonated with them. And then they have to listen because they have to summarize everything that everyone said.
Absolutely.
And I think you could do that for informational text.
I work very hard to pick the informational text that I use in those kinds of longer studies, right? If it's a boring, poorly written text, I'm not going to use that as a mentor text. I'm going to go ahead and make my PowerPoint, give the kids the information, do something interesting with that, and move on. The texts that I want to grapple with in my class are ones that are interesting. We've done ones on neurons and the way that memory works, all kinds of environmental texts. If it's written well, one of the texts that we studied in the dissertation research, we did 3 text studies in a row. One of them was about lost languages and languages that are dying, and the things that some people are doing to try to save those languages. The next week, we read about teens helping elders to learn tech skills. That one was an NPR story, a radio story. They have transcripts. And the great thing about that is our first listen is the radio story. Then our second read is the transcript. And so we're going deeper and deeper in. If the kids aren't listening to something first, I'll read aloud the first time we read a complex text, at least to get them started. And can I say one thing? Y'all, please don't do popcorn reading. Please don't. Our teachers did it to us, and their teachers did it before them. As a strong reader, nerdy kid, teacher's pet, I loved popcorn reading, right? Because I was ready, and I loved to read aloud. It causes trauma for some kids. And guess what? That turn taking that I was talking about, the other students are not listening to their peers stumble through the text. It's not happening.
And it's great you mentioned this, because a better way of doing that is through the discussion small group protocols that you mentioned. Because they can still get the practice of speaking, but not in front of everyone.
Exactly.
And if they're stumbling, their peers are more apt to pay attention because they have something they need to accomplish. And
we're about to do something. We're trying to understand. A lot of times with our first read, and this is strategies, I have a whole chapter on each of these 4 prongs of the deep sense approach. And there are lesson plan templates and all that jazz. But when I am asking kids, we're going to read this text the first time, I typically will ask them something general. Let's focus on trying to understand what is the most important point this author or this radio host or whatever is trying to make. What is something interesting that you didn't know? What is something that contradicts something you thought you knew? Things like that that are broad. Everybody in the room can get a piece of that, right? You don't have to be an expert in the topic. You're listening, but it engages them. They were in their student teaching. They were seniors at University of Houston and already in the classroom getting ready to teach full time. And we did a lot of work on developing lesson plans, and they would just fight me on this. But they would write the lesson plan, and the first reading, they would just release it to the kids and say, okay, read this. And I'm like, that's not scaffolding. You're not supporting the first read. Let's do it together. You don't have to slog through the whole thing together, but you've got to do whatever for that class. But if you have a lot of kids who are reading under grade level, then let's break it up. Or if we're going to listen to a recording, don't make them sit through 15 minutes. No one is going to be tuned in. It's not their fault. We have given them too much cognitive overload and they've tuned out. So I break it and I ask a question. Okay, let's write down something, whatever. Reading actively is the third group of strategies that I have. Everything is about keeping the mind engaged in meaning making. It is not natural for humans to sit and deeply stare at a text and make sense of it over a long period of time. That is not instinctive behavior. It's learned and it takes practice. And just like we've heard all of these athletes are talking now about their deep breathing and their meditation strategies to help them with their performance, reading is like that too. I can teach my students to bring their minds back, but it would be silly of me to think that my 8th graders on their own, no matter what, I'm sitting at the desk and they're just magically doing that without any reminders from me, any checks from me.
So we mentioned building confidence as the first pillar. Second pillar, adopting and implementing particular engagement and reading strategies.
It is that text-centered discussion. And then the fourth that you don't do all the time is when you can, doing those longer, more in-depth text studies of an interesting article or other text, taking them through those pre-reading strategies, that first read, going back and reading it again for a different purpose, and then doing meaningful activities post-reading. The research is very clear that if we do not lead kids through that entire pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading process, they're just not going to get as much meaning out of the text. This is what's different from how we teach novels and short stories. It matters what the author intended, right? We cannot say, whatever you get out of it, it's a different opinion. Nope. So we have to teach them that our job is, number one, to understand what did the author intend for me to understand? What ideas and information is this author trying to get me to understand? How did they put their argument or their thesis together? And then can you explain it? Because the informational texts, unlike novels, are meant to be shared, meant to be explained. They're teaching tools, right? We write an informational text not for our own pleasure. We write it to teach. And so kids can become part of that culture. And so reading, maybe it's once a quarter if that's all you have time for. But if the science teacher does it once a quarter, and the social studies teacher does it once a quarter, and the English teacher is doing it a little bit more often, the English teacher isn't just doing novels and wonderful short stories and poems. They are finding interesting, not just memoir, but actual informational texts that are expository in nature or argumentative, and doing that same rich work. The research suggests that we don't do a lot of reading in middle and high school or college. The
So
time that we actually spend on reading is
minimal.
it's a practice set of skills.
Now, that was important, and I'm glad you mentioned it. It really is a skill that needs to be practiced. So when
Yeah.
you were talking about teaching student teachers and then just giving the reading to the students, I see a lot of veteran teachers doing that too.
I do that. Read their annotations. Really read them. If you're doing a lot of short answer responses, you have the kids read a text, write a short answer response. It's something you do all the time. Really read their short answer responses. If you're having them do Cornell Notes, read it. I hate to break it to you, but teaching is hard work and it's time consuming. There's just no way around it. I used a program called Active Learning. It's one of those great programs where they
Uh-huh.
have an informational text, the kids can interact with it, but Active Learning allowed me to upload my own text and set it up in a similar way. I would embed little short answer, open-ended questions. I would do some multiple choice, but mostly a little open-ended. And it allowed me to go in and read them quickly. Now you could do the same thing with index cards. It doesn't matter.
The same thing on AI actually now too.
Absolutely. So read them. If I can call Jose over because I just looked at what he wrote for the question that relates to that first part of the passage, and I'm like, okay, tell me how you worked on that. Tell me about how you read that. Usually, Jose is going to say, Miss, I skimmed through it. I think I need to go back and read it again. They learn to self assess that. Again, if they're not making sense on the page or they're not making sense when they are talking about the text, it is probably because they never actually made meaning of it.
And though, Gwen, what you're doing, I can understand why your student scores went up.
Yeah.
Because what we're actually doing when we're going back and looking at their work, their annotations,
Yeah.
their Cornell notes, and really tying the two together because it works best
Yeah.
as a strategy when you're doing both, not just hitting for annotation's sake. But what you're actually really doing is you are assessing them. You're doing interim
All the
assessment.
time.
So that way you are, like you said, intervening at that moment when they are sitting for that state exam. They're apt to do better
Yeah.
because you've already intervened and had conversations with students about how to be more effective.
So, John, when I was 5 years in as a social studies teacher, I was still giving these group projects with the readings, and they had tasks and they had all these interim goals. And the truth is that I didn't look at their thinking and their work. I would monitor and walk around and listen, but I wasn't really looking at their interim products because it was too much paper. And I would wait until the presentation or the PowerPoint or the skit, the oral presentation, whatever it was, or the essay or the research paper. And over again, I was crushed. Oh, God, how did they learn so little? Oh, my God. The truth is that slogging through a bunch of half-baked end products that are long and complex, and now I'm grading a 5-page research paper that is inane. I would much rather read 2 sentences on the first page of an article that they've annotated, skim it and go, ooh, uh-oh. Okay, sweetie, try reading those 2 paragraphs again because I think that you'll see there's a little bit more to it than that. Would you check with Susie over here and see what she wrote? It's high leverage, short, quick. That's the secret for me because I still grade a lot, but I catch it early and I intervene fast. If an athletic coach or a music teacher just let it all ride and then hope that the performance, the game, the concert goes well, they're going to be crushed.
That is such an important point to end on,
Yeah.
that it's our role not to wait for the end, to be working with our students as that coach, not just to give them the reading if we're a content area teacher, but to actually coach them through the reading and to develop those skills so they could read independently themselves.
Yeah.
Gwen, where can people find out more information about you and the work you do?
I have a Substack called Teaching Teens. You can find me, I have a website, pauloskipedagogy.com, and the book is sold wherever books are sold.
Gwen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.